I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Hey, listeners, I want to let you know about two opportunities with Gotham Writers Workshop. Gotham Writers Workshop has been very supportive to Memoir Nation. I'm happy to say that I've taken Gotham workshops in the past, and I just had a great experience. And of note, coming up in March, Gotham Writers Workshop is hosting, both on Zoom and in person in New York City, a conference that's really tailor-made for you, memoir writers and nonfiction writers alike. And the weekend will consist of panels on publishing and Q&A sessions and agent pitching roundtables in which you'll be able to present your writing directly to literary agents. And so to learn more about the Gotham Writers Nonfiction Conference, visit gothamwriters.com/conference. That's gothamwriters.com/conference. And to sweeten the deal, Gotham is offering you an affiliate code for a discount on their classes. So use code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them Brooke and Grant sent you.
Hello, creators, artisans, shapers, and world builders. Welcome to another episode of Memoir Nation, and thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Brooke Warner, here as always with Grant Faulkner, my co-pilot. And sometimes, Grant, I read a book that stands out in a class of its own. And so when it comes to trying to nail down a theme or a singular idea for what the show should be about, it's not easy or obvious. And that was definitely the case this week with our guest, Sarah Aziza's memoir, The Hollow Half. It is a book about Sarah's body, her lived experience as a Palestinian American. It's about desire and repression, about self-deprivation in the form of a very severe eating disorder. And it's about self-erasure and family history and trauma. And so there was just so much packed into this book. And as I read, and once I was finished, the single thought or descriptor that floated to mind for me over and over was beautiful. And of course, it's more than that. You know, it's tragic and ambitious and complex. But it got me thinking that a good theme for us to bat around this week would be memoir as art, because that is how I experienced The Hollow Half. And I wanted to ask you if you think that should be a requisite. Should all memoirists strive to be artistic in their efforts, or do you enjoy memoirs that are more straightforward stories?
Yeah, that's such a great question to ponder, especially for me, because I try to make everything I write into art. And I'm certainly doing that with my memoir that I'm working on now. That's just so much of the joy and the meaning of it for me. But then, just as in fiction that's highly literary, there's also fiction that's plot-driven and action-oriented or escapist. And I think the genre of memoir is big enough to include it all as well. Like sometimes the more straightforward stories serve the truth of the writer better than a more artistic version. And that's the criteria for me, is how does the form serve the story? I do want to note that I'm pleasantly surprised by how dynamic the memoir genre is and how much it's growing and evolving and how artistic it is, because I think a lot of people who don't read memoir maybe don't realize that.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is interesting. And certainly something that I think people either, certainly know. And one of the things I guess I think is like, there's room for everything, right? Because you don't have to write a book that is lyrical or literary like Sarah's, and like our feedback or way of describing her book might be that the book is gorgeous and beautiful. And a lot of the feedback on Goodreads was that people absolutely loved it, but they also at times were saying that they felt a little bit lost. And I think that's the reason for that was because it is such an ambitious book. And so she had this scope that might have made it a difficult read for some people. I personally personally didn't really feel that way, but I love books like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember talking with Amir McBride and how she said that her job is not to make the reading experience easy. I have to go back and listen to that interview because I don't remember her exact words, but the implication was that reading literature should not be the equivalent of zoning out and, watching a show that we like, or literature is not brain candy and working for it is part of the point, at least for some writers. So I agree with this and I don't, because I don't mind a straightforward narrative, or maybe it's that like there are all kinds of selections that we can make. And, one day you might want to work for something and the other day you might want something that is more of a zone out book. And sometimes a book is about the story and not about showing prowess, and I'm sure I've shared this story before on the podcast at some point, but one of my more formative experiences at Seal Press was this book that I worked on about open marriage. The book is called Open. It's a good book, but not a literary book by any means. And as the author's editor, I wanted it to be better. I wanted the prose to sing, but the author just was not that kind of writer. And at the end of the day, it was just as good as it was going to be. It was as far as she could take it. And I remember feeling disappointed that I couldn't do more for it. But then that book went on to do amazingly well because the author was really a dynamo who promoted it everywhere and did not shy away from what was a pretty salacious topic. And because people wanted to read about open marriage, and so no one was like, oh, this book should have been more literary. And it was a really good lesson for me because sometimes, a lot of times even, people are picking up books because they want that lighter lift and they just want a good story without the pyrotechnics or the fancy language or, the outside of the box executions.
I can see that, and it mirrors my own reading preferences these days, perhaps because, life feels really heavy. And so I don't mind reading a book in the class of that book, Open. Recently, I read Chore Play by Jordan Carlos, and his book is very straightforward. And even though it's dealing with a, heavy subject, marriage and unequal division of labor in most marriages, he's a comedian. So the art of the book is more his comedy than any kind of fine artistry or language play, at least in the literary sense. But I enjoyed it thoroughly. And because I normally read literary memoirs, I had to remind myself of how meaningful a book like this is. It's essentially good plane reading, good beach reading, good before bedtime reading, all of which we need in some regard. I think most of us do. But then I'll say that the book that I've said this before that's most impacted my own writing in the last couple of years, and that felt like the kind of memoir I really want to write, is Maggie Smith's You Could Make This Place Beautiful. And I would classify that book as memoir, as art. I also think she managed to set a new bar for what memoir can be, maybe just because of the way her book broke out. Like reading Sarah's book, you see some of that similar type of execution and style of lots of white space on the page and of creative layout and of playing with form. And in Sarah's case, her use of extensive footnotes, and notably it's written in a very fragmented style. And we've talked about this personally and on the show, Brooke, about the popularity of this fragmented style and its emergence as probably the most popular structure for memoir right now. And I guess we can only speak anecdotally about it, but it does feel that it's surpassing the chronological structure and maybe becoming the new normal for memoir. So I'm curious, why do you think that is?
My theory is that it's because it's so freeing.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of writers are seeing other writers like Sarah, like Maggie, like Carmen Maria Machado, like Lydia Yuknavitch, and they're striving not only to be more lyrical writers like all of these writers are, but they're also feeling like, oh, I can do that. I can write in the second person. I don't have to weave a chronological narrative when frankly, I'm struggling to remember all the bits and pieces of my life anyway. The fragmented style mirrors how we remember, I think. Like memory does not arrive in a neat chronology, of course. It comes in flashes and gaps and repetitions and sensory shards. And so it's a structure that honors the reality, of our experience instead of forcing it into some kind of artificial arc, which has been a big complaint. It's been a complaint from lots of writers about, like some of the limitations around the classical way that we think about storytelling. And for Sarah, for instance, and others like her, these classical structures have been like an imposition of white culture and have been sort of a celebration of the dominant literary canon. And I do think that some people are very interested in breaking away from that. And there's a fabulous interview I read with Sarah in which she gets into the depth of her craft. And so I do just want to read this because I just thought it was so interesting and speaks to this. She says, I was definitely brought up with a lot of conventional American English craft. In high school, all of the readings I can remember doing were Hawthorne and Shakespeare, very white Anglo-American canon. I remember learning to write the 5-paragraph essay and book reports and things like that, being directed when examining literature to identify themes and answer questions, and to believe that there's a one-to-one correspondence between symbols. Usually there's some latent Christian messaging as well.
Yeah.
And, that resonates. And I think we're seeing a pushback against conventional structure for reasons that stem from people being like, I don't want to do that anymore. And by the way, shove it, patriarchy. And also because fragmentation can feel like a more honest way to deliver a narrative. So I'd love to ask you, Grant, just in light of talking about Maggie Smith and in light of the aftermath of Jan Your Story, how your memoir is coming along, and if there's anything that you want to share, because I know you've been drawn to the fragmented form. And I also know you've said that this is how you've always written. So it's not maybe so much of a departure for you, but it does sound like these writers who are doing fragmented work have or are kind of paving a way forward for you. And as is the case for a lot of us, I think.
Definitely. And I just want to guide listeners to our interview with Jane Allison, who wrote this fantastic book that was dealing with other plot structures, exactly this kind of plot structure. And I heard Anna Johnson give this great speech on the fragmented narrative form, and he tied it to kind of the best way to represent trauma, and I think that that's another part of it. But it's interesting because I once broached this question with my agent. I think this was a couple years ago, so maybe the trend wasn't as much in place then. But I was telling her about the shape of my memoir, and I felt some pushback from her, and it was judicious pushback. But then I said something like, well, why can't I be like Maggie Smith? And she said, because you're not Maggie Smith, which I thought was funny and true. There are some authors who get to write in a certain style, and for whatever reason, it can be hard for others to write in that style and be accepted, especially when it's kind of an outsider style. So I definitely think that the others who are writing these more fragmented narratives are definitely paving a way forward for others, because we're just seeing so much of it now. And also, per my agent's perspective, I need to write in a form that serves my story, as I always say. But that form might be challenging to read, which I like to some extent, per your comments earlier, Brooke. But I don't want it to be alienating or disorienting. I think the reader needs an anchor, something to grasp onto. So I actually took my collage of a memoir and gave it more structure. You might call this a compromise, but I think it's a good compromise. There's more of a noticeable structure, and that structure serves to support, the collage-like experience rather than change it into a linear narrative. So I feel like it's working right now. So how about you, Brooke? Are you executing a fragmented structure as well?
Yes and no. I think my story has to be more linear than I originally thought, because like you, after I read You Could Make This Place Beautiful, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a revelation. Like, I can do this. But then, I don't know. It was a little too much, so I think it's how it goes. Sometimes like you're exploring the container of your story and what you want it to be. And I'm in that place for sure. And, I had executed a very chronological, like 20,000 words. And now I'm kind of tearing apart and kind of putting it back together, which is interesting. But, I think the thing I want to share is that I can see it in my mind's eye, but then you actually have to like write the thing. So you have this kind of like perfect outcome, and it sort of makes sense, but it's nebulous and you have to write into it. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if you could just have the fully formed vision of the thing you want to do manifest before you? And of course, I'm kidding, because no, not really, right? The work of it is part of the reward. But I just, I have to confess, I never dreamed it would be as difficult as it has proven to be to write this book for lots of reasons.
It's always almost harder to write the book than you ever think it will be. And I know we've both been humbled to some extent by our books, and gaining humility is part of the writing process, I think. And I was about to say, if you want a fully formed vision of the thing you want to manifest, give AI a whirl. But I don't think you'd want that, because the work is the reward. And I was so daunted by restructuring my memoir. It was like building a new house in some ways after already building a house, but it turned out to be necessary for my own writing experience and my own growth because, we've said this many times with memoir, the story changes as you write it. And my story has changed as I've realized new things, and my collage, for lack of a better word, keeps going to new places and kind of taking new shapes.
That's great. Well, before we come to a close here, Grant, since we're talking about memoirs, how conscious are you of wanting your memoir to be a work of art? I mean, you said before a little bit to that, but is it an important goal, or something that you're aiming for, or does that just put too much pressure on it?
I think I actually always aim to make whatever I'm writing into art. And I just don't have as much fun writing it if that's not the case. And I don't find as much meaning unless I'm thinking of the contours of the story and the rhythms and the mood of a sentence. And I really try to make most things I write, kind of into a type of prose poem in a way. And my new book, Something Out There in the Distance, definitely takes that form. And, I kind of feel like a book is a stage, so the writing has to live up to certain expectations of a performance. And I'll close with that. That's one reason I'm excited to talk with Sarah. She's a poet fundamentally, and we will dig deeper into her memoir and talk with her after this short break. Hey, everybody. Some of you know that we have been growing our Memoir Nation community over the course of the past year, and that we hosted a writing challenge in January called Jan Your Story, and that was in January, one more time, where over 1,500 writers wrote as many days as they could in January, some of them every day, and some of them more than 500 words, much more. And now that we're in February, we've been casting our view out over the horizon of 2026. And we have some new offerings we want to share with you. Brooke, will you share all the things that are available to the citizens and would-be citizens of Memoir Nation?
Absolutely. My honor. And thank you, listeners. I mean, first and foremost, I want to say Memoir Nation is a free community, and we have this amazing community space where you can connect with other writers, post anything you want about your writing, your goals, challenges, wins, etc. And we have a paid level. And that one we keep adding to. And because of all the new additions that we have, we want to make sure to share with you what is coming up and what's been added. So here's the list of stuff, everybody. We have monthly classes, first of all. I also want to say the caliber of people that we are bringing is truly extraordinary. We've had Maggie Smith, Carvel Wallace, Amanda Knox, among others. Coming up, we have Mark Nepo, who wrote The Book of Awakening, Myra Hornbacher, who wrote Wasted and Madness, and then Victoria Chang, author of Dear Memory, among other books. Amazing, amazing memoir and other poetry books. And then beyond the classes, we have a monthly book club and a whole bunch of quarterly events, including Writing About Other People, which is a support group, and a deep dive into your emotions writing group. Grant is doing a generative writing circle, and I am doing Craft Corner, also quarterly. So we're just adding and adding and adding. And while some of that adding might feel like more offerings than you can even take advantage of, and I totally understand that as well, we do want you to think of it like a well-stocked buffet. And you don't have to partake of every single thing, but it's always there for you, freshly stocked. Plus, you can have these cool go-to containers in the form of videos and archives. And, so if there's anything you ever miss, you can catch up.
Dang, I love that well-stocked buffet and the to-go containers. Perfect metaphors, Brooke. And also on this paid path, there's our Show Up and Write sessions, which I run on Thursdays and you run on Sundays. And you get a lifetime subscription to our Substack newsletter. And we're building out more features all the time. So please come check out Memoir Nation, see what we're doing. We're working super hard to bring real value to our paid membership tiers. And it's very community-driven, I have to say. That's one thing that I'm just so inspired by, is seeing the community in action. And we've been responding to what people in our community want and need, and we just keep adding stuff, like Brooke said, like our 2026 memoir roadmap, which is actually accessible to any member, including at the free level, because we want you to keep writing.
Yeah, absolutely. So go in at the free level and download that roadmap. It's beautiful. It's a fillable PDF. I have been using it myself. And, Grant, I've done a lot of business endeavors over the years. And I can say the value is there on this one. I mean, we feel it. We want you all to go check it out. And even though this is an advertisement, and obviously we are asking you all to go check out our offerings, become a paid member if you're so moved, we're also coming at this whole endeavor with a spirit of generosity and community. And the very most important thing is that we have this space for all of you to connect, to celebrate, to teach you how to be better memoirists, and to help you find like-minded people. So please come check out all of it at memoirnation.com. Welcome back, everyone. We're so honored to have Sarah Aziza with us today. Sarah is a Palestinian-American writer, translator, and artist with roots in Iblis and Deir al-Balah, Gaza. She is the author of the genre-bending memoir, The Hollow Half, winner of the Palestinian Book Award, and named a most anticipated and best book of the year by Vulture, Vanity Fair, Literary Hub, Elle, and others. Sarah's award-winning journalism, poetry, and essays and experimental nonfiction have appeared all over the place in The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Best American Essays, and elsewhere. She's also the recipient of fellowships and support from Fulbright, MacDowell, USA Artists, and others. Sarah lived and worked in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, South Africa, and Palestine, and now resides here in the U.S. on occupied Munsi, Lenape, and Canarsie land. Sarah, thank you for being with us. We're really, really, truly privileged to have you.
No, likewise. It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, to start, your book, The Hollow Half, weaves together many strands of ideas and experience and history. It's really ambitious and beautiful. And I wanted to ask you to start by talking about the origins of this memoir, when you knew you wanted to write it, and what did you think about it when it was first like a seed of an idea, like when you first ventured out to put pen to page?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. It's kind of an interesting, to me, story, a little bit of a surprise, or actually looking back, still quite surprised that this book happened, because it was kind of unintentional. And I feel like every step of the way was sort of an experiment that was half thought out and half intuitive, and also completely, terrifying for me in the moment, because I had always conceived of a book as something sort of like beyond my scope. I'm grateful that I was able to really begin writing without sort of that hanging over my head. I'm setting out to write a cross-generational, cross-genre, experimental memoir. That would have been obviously, well, not obviously, but like to me, obviously too intimidating to sort of approach. But what happened was, as you know from the book, I was hospitalized in 2019 for anorexia. I was sort of cut off from the world for 4 months in this very extreme sort of environment, a public psychiatric hospital, and emerged feeling completely disoriented, really alienated from myself. The life and the person I thought I was and the life I thought I was living sort of felt like it had ended almost abruptly and without my realizing. And I felt really unsure of where I was in the world and who I was. I had been working as a journalist, but only for a couple of years. So I was really just getting started as a writer. I felt like I was going to need to find some other way to make my way through the world. I had kind of resigned myself not to writing anymore, being that I internalized this idea that my brain was broken, from this time in the psychiatric hospital. All that to say, I was working odd jobs when the pandemic hit. I was discharged in 2020 in February. So I had a couple weeks on planet Earth before everything just kind of obviously turned upside down. And so I was kind of careening from all of these experiences. And, at some point, like in the early spring of 2020, I started having dreams of my grandmother, my Sittu, my Palestinian grandmother, who had been dead for years. And sort of almost subconsciously, I was waking up from these dreams or coming out of these dreams or coming through these dreams, not really waking up, but just finding myself almost in this hypnotic state at my computer, kind of like typing out the memories that were coming up from these dreams, memories I hadn't thought about in years, memories as an assimilated, immigrant's kid or somewhat assimilated, thought that were just belong to the past. I mean, it doesn't even have to do necessarily with being an immigrant, but I think a lot of us walk through our days without thinking actively about our earliest memories, especially if we're not, actively in therapy. But, just really surprising, just flashes of this sunny morning in the kitchen. The first time I remember seeing my grandmother when she came over to visit us in Illinois, just these fragments. Anyway, I kind of was seized by this fever of writing everything I could remember. I think this like latent ache and missing I had for her was coming out through this desire to use words to grasp at whatever I could sort of like retrieve from the past. I was doing this completely at night, completely without telling anyone, basically without even like admitting to myself. During the day, I was just a frantic, socially distanced person like everyone else. But in the night, I had these trysts almost with my memory. And when I ran out of memories, when I had like excavated everything that I could reach at that time, I was not satisfied. I was hungry. I wanted to know more. And, revisiting these moments, looking at my grandmother from this childlike point of view, but now as a woman in my late 20s at the time, I had all these questions about my grandmother's life as a woman and wanting to know so much more about her story, subjectivity. And, that set me off on a long journey of interviewing family, archival research, lots of other forms of research. And about a year and a half in, one of my best friends who's a filmmaker actually caught wind that I had written over like 150 pages. And she was the one who said, I think you're writing a book. So that's the origin story. I had to back myself into it. It was terrifying. I was in denial for a while after that, but here we are.
I love that phrase, trysts with my memory. It's so beautiful. And I read a really beautiful review of your book, and I want to quote from it. It appeared in the Baffler, and here's the quote. Told across the fault lines of language and geography, it traverses multiple selves and sites, Palestinian and American, daughter and witness, exile and return, without collapsing them into false unity. Instead, Aziza offers a form that honors fragmentation as its own kind of truth. And many authors long to do this, but they can't find their way through. And you unapologetically, weave together strands that, in and of themselves could have made for two books, particularly the journey of your eating disorder and the journey of your Palestinian heritage. So I was wondering, can you talk about taking on these two big, important parts of your personal journey and heritage and putting them into a single narrative?
Yeah, the fragmentary form, I feel like it's revolutionary and also almost overexposed at this point. I feel like people have such mixed feelings because when it's done right or when it's the time to use it, it's exactly as it should, it feels like the only possible way. Mm-hmm. And then there's other times where, at least I question for myself, like, am I just being lazy or avoidant? Am I creating these like elliptical gaps just because I don't want to go into this part of my story or, but I think that, that reviewer really landed on something that I eventually had to conclude for myself, which was, part of why I think I felt so lost as a person and also as a writer was because I didn't think those fragments and fault lines and shatterings and unanswerable, questions and belonged. I felt like, especially having been trained as a journalist, having been, as a literature student, as an undergrad in the Western canon, there's a lot of beginning, middle, and end, hero's journey. Even in therapy, this pressure to like just create links and draw straight lines as if straight lines will heal us, as if human beings are made of like right angles, I think there was just a lot of reckoning in that time personally. And then also on the page of the fact that those ideas weren't serving me and actually were really, in some cases, dangerous or imprisoning. And, it might sound a little bit like grandiose, but eventually I had to take on for myself that Toni Morrison quote, if you haven't read the book that you need, then you should write it. And that ended up being, I don't really say that out loud because, it just sounds a little grandiose for me, but internally that was sort of my North Star. Every time I felt myself like losing a little bit of courage doing something like especially structurally ambitious or just to me like new, there was a lot of things I tried that, I'm sure other people have done, but I just hadn't seen myself. And feeling that like need for even more permission, I just sort of would spool that quote out again for myself of like, I needed this. I needed these gaps to belong, or I needed these shatterings to be put side by side and like claimed inside of a single story. And, diaspora and displacement and war, like these never cohere into like a neat package. And I think, I just for my past self, future self, and just so many other people I know deal with these involuntary shatterings that aren't often, languaged. That's where I kind of departed from.
Thank you for naming that commonality as shatterings, because it's just it resonates. And I read an interview with Mizna. Oh my gosh, what a great interview. And you shared about being interested early on in what felt interstitial. So to quote you, you said what was in the shadows or the gaps or the white spaces, and you're speaking to that now. And you feel that you certainly feel that exploration in this book. And I know it's clear that you broke conventional rules to get there. And you did study literature in college. And so you were going into this already, but will you share a little bit more explicitly about that risk taking? I mean, beyond having Toni Morrison in your ear and saying, like, I'm going to keep going, like, what did you learn about your own craft from breaking the quote unquote rules?
Wow. Yeah. What did I learn? I mean, it's so interesting how people talk about voice. Voice is something that I feel is so elusive. There are probably some fairly universal rules of thumb about finding your voice, but I also feel like it's so mysterious and personal. So I think that there was a lot of trying and experimenting alone in my room. I called it my mad laboratory. I was very alone in the first several years because I think I was trying to learn. I actually usually use the word music. I felt most of the time like there was a distant note sounding and I was trying to match it, or almost like this idea of like a tuning fork, and I was plucking until I noticed that I felt like this vibration was matching whatever that ineffable sort of rhythm or music was that I couldn't quite hear, but I knew when I was touching it. So there was a lot of learning to hone that, and I eventually I became much more fluent in my own music and voice, or I'll at least say the music and voice of this book. A lot of what led me to the place that I ended up mentally and emotionally and artistically in 2019, basically a wreck, very alienated, successful on one side, but deeply otherwise, for the rest of my subjectivity, I was pretty wrecked. It was because I had lost all touch with my intuition. So I think there was a lot of learning to trust and know my intuition all over again. And that was really completely paralleled on the page. So when I would come to sort of an impasse, or I'd be trying and feeling creatively stuck to sort of figure out a way to express a certain moment of my story or a feeling, or even just narratively figuring out my relationship to the nonfiction research and the stories of others, and the idea of time and how do I tell the stories that I wasn't there for, all of those questions. There were times that I tried something that felt crazy or wrong or, not allowed. And it just resonated so hard. And eventually I had built the muscle of well, if I feel this sure about it, even though I don't have any external validation yet that this is allowed or going to work, I'm going to plow ahead. And it's just the very end of the process with working with an editor and then publishing it that I've actually been able, it felt like a big leap, to see what the response would be, and just learning that some of the things that I felt crazy doing were the things that readers just took completely in stride, didn't even strike them as that strange, and or were the parts that they found really moving or familiar.
Good lesson there for all writers. Well, you've spoken about leaving journalism, your frustration and your anger with what you were being asked to cover and how you were being asked to cover it. And also specifically that you felt exploited, that you were being asked to confirm biases in, as you say, your Arab voice. So I'm curious if this book is in part a response to that frustration and the limitations being imposed on your writing.
I think most of us are probably aware that there's a lot wrong with the media landscape in the United States right now, and has been for a while. And then specifically trying to break into the more reporting, international reporting. I had this exciting idea of bringing stories from my people to a larger audience and making change, and instead just finding often, like you said, I was almost laundering preconceived notions about the Middle East, and there were only a few slots I was allowed to fill, and if the women weren't oppressed enough or whatever in my stories, they kind of weren't legible. I would say that maybe the book is more a product. I hate that word, but I would say it almost comes subconsciously from that frustration. I tried not to write, I think probably you talk to so many memoir writers, they probably talk about working through anger or grudges or things like off the page or on different pages than the pages that are in the book. Like I didn't want it, and spite is fine. Spite is great. Anger is great. But I didn't feel like, I feel like there was more depth that I was trying to accomplish. The bigger work was trying to forget that any of that existed and write the book that I thought my people and my past self and, you know, people I'd never met, but cared about in some ways who might be suffering or feeling alone in some way. I was just trying to think only of those readers, and not write out of spite, out of reaction, out of anger or anything, or even, you know, the more softer toned form of this, which would be to try to humanize. I also was trying not to do that. I was just trying to write in a fullness that I had never had permission for anywhere else and see where that went. So I think that's where I was coming from mostly.
It's effective. So that's interesting to hear about. And, you know, you use some artistic devices in this book as well, redactions. You have extensive footnotes that are woven throughout. And you also include stories about your grandmother that are maybe imagined or dreamed. And, you know, so this sense that you're evoking her from the beyond, which you spoke to earlier. Can you talk about giving yourself permission to do those things? Because in the memoir classes I teach, my students are often like very locked up about what they don't remember, you know, and then when I read something like your book, The Hollow Half, I see how much freedom of expression you've given yourself. And, you know, some of that is about not remembering and finding other ways in. And so I wonder if that was something you gave yourself or if it was something you had to fight for.
Yeah, I mentioned the permission a little bit earlier as well. It was just a simultaneous assortment of things. I think there was that honing of my intuitive muscle and my willingness and faith to just respond and follow it. I think there was also an untangling of this idea that I can only put on the page what I think will be legible or familiar or understandable to X reader. And again, that goes back to the last question of who is my reader? And as I start to untangle that, I also found more latitude because, again, sprinkling in Arabic, for example, or mixing sort of like almost, I would say, mediums or like registers of reality, that actually isn't so strange in other traditions or to certain people. And I also, of course, had help and inspiration from so many others. Like, again, I joked about being in my mad laboratory, but actually my mad laboratory is full of books. I had so many teachers from like Saidiya Hartman and the idea of critical fabulation. She's like this academic who talks about, you know, working in the archive and like with a deep commitment to fact and to artifact, but also in this sort of, you know, the words I've been using for the last like year or two is like ancestral collaboration, which is just like you get into a certain zone where you know you've done absolute due diligence. I went to the furthest extent I could to gather stories. In journalism, they tell you if you start hearing the same things over and over again, you know you've reported enough. So I got the full scope of the stories that my family had, or, you know, historically, you know, academically, what was available. And then I was giving myself permission. And that's a Saidiya Hartman sort of like lesson. There were writers like E.J. Koh, whose beautiful memoir, The Magic Language of Others, was the first time I think I consciously noticed that someone was writing. She writes about like her grandmother's life in these vivid novel-like scenes. And I also know that she has a PhD in Korean history. So you can sort of see that activated, but in a very narrative way. And I realized she was another person who gave me permission through her example. And then The Man Who Could Move Clouds by Ingrid Rojas Contreras she talks about in a craft talk about just like, yeah, her grandfather, her family, they're psychics, they can move clouds. And like in Colombia, that's not a strange thing to say, but, you know, she was disciplined out of, you know, talking about that at all for various reasons around white people. And, you know, and then she wrote this beautiful book. So there's a lot of examples. I definitely wasn't inventing the wheel.
And what a beautiful answer. We've had both of them on the podcast. So we're all in good company there. We love them. Yeah, well, you capture in the book your family's loss and how they were driven out of Palestine, and you write not only about the Nakba and what was lost, you also share so personally about your dad's longing about the land and about the house he was going to build and the life that was taken from all of them. And there's a deep-rooted trauma from this mass displacement of Palestinians that occurred in 1947 to 1949, during the war surrounding the creation of the State of Israel. And I'm hoping you'll share with us about the timing of your book. Were you writing it already when October 7th happened, or how did that unfold and inform your narrative?
Whew, yeah. Yeah, thank you for bringing in that history and the Nakba. I started the book in 2020. Like I said, not consciously aware I was writing the book, but by 2021, I had gotten an agent. The book was well underway. I had a lot of it plotted out, and I sold it in June 2023. So before October 7th, 2023, I sold it on partial with the full outline. So I was not finished with the book when October 7th happened. I mean, it was just a really horrific experience, and I feel like what unfolded after did not shock a lot of us. And I've always felt specific fear around my family in Gaza because of the precarity of the people in Gaza is just of another magnitude than I think even the rest of Palestinian bodies. So, the math is there. They kidnapped one Israeli soldier and they, the Israelis killed 1,300 of us. So just the math, immediately was clear to me. So yeah. And then we saw unfold what we all saw unfold, a full scale genocide. And I was trying to write this book. I also was kind of putting my journalism hat back on a little bit to do a lot of essays and coverage of what was going on in real time. So I was writing kind of frantically at that time. I don't know. I had this bit of manic urgency to my process at that time. So I was writing nonstop in 2023 terms and trying to also at certain times of the day, live inside Nablus in 2017, for example, write Palestine alive, write Palestine vibrant, still under occupation, but in a different time with a different amount of hope. And, even travel back earlier to my grandmother's childhood and try to honor the fullness of a Palestinian lifetime that has so much tenderness and hope and beauty, but is also so under threat and was under threat in obviously such an extreme and acute way. Honestly, I'm still recovering from it emotionally, just the amount of the emotional register and range I was trying to occupy, the amount of energy I was pouring into whatever I felt like I could possibly do in desperation from where I was to try to raise awareness, speak out, warn against what was coming. And then when it was actually, arriving and not stopping, just the heartbreak and the simultaneous loss. I've lost over 100 relatives at this point. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah. So grieving with my family, fearing for my family, raising money and trying to write this book.
Yeah.
But the thing that did change a lot though was the last chapter. I changed it from each chapter has a title that's based on a concept / Arabic word. And the last chapter was tarjum, which means to translate. And it was going to be more about identity and shifting and queerness and all of that. What's the word? Code switching, all of that. And I changed it to the word muqawama, which means resistance. And it was an examination of, I just tried to weave in more of the ways in which the historical struggle to free Palestine has intersected with my family and all the different forms of resistance the Palestinian people have tried to take up and how it endures and also the toll that takes. Mm-hmm. I wanted people to be able to be fully equipped to understand, just what an impasse the Palestinian people have faced for so long and the necessity to continue to resist occupation and obviously, genocide. Yeah, in a nuanced sort of way that also is really grounded in personal narrative. I didn't want people to walk away from the book and only think of Palestinians as numbers or a mass of, dangerous, hungry, poor people. I wanted them to understand how individual people have wrestled with this unfreedom of Palestine for lifetimes. So that was the major shift, is just bringing in more of that. And that also felt the riskiest because stepping towards like certain words like resistance can really put some people off and can put you out there, make you vulnerable to other sorts of aggression. But it felt absolutely necessary. I am convinced that love must resist oppression. And it's not a unique Palestinian thing. It's just a truth. And I think a lot of us probably feel a version of that right now, even in this country.
Absolutely.
Well, Sarah, in closing, I wanted to ask you about writing about other people. Your husband in the book is just referred to as C, and I imagine you couldn't write the story without him, but your treatment of him feels careful. And I think I understand why that's the case, given the terrain of your memoir. And you write about your grandmother's story in various ways that I know required deep consideration for who she was and what she lived through. So for our listeners who are writing memoirs and they're worried about how to portray someone that they care about, what advice do you have for, parameters and boundaries on the page?
Yeah, that was a question I was kind of working out along the way. I definitely couldn't write the story without C, and I didn't want to. I'll speak to that character first. And I'm sure your students are all aware / are learning that I like to think of it as character, but just like the idea of like, there's a difference between the Sada on the page and the one in real, the one speaking to you right now. And yeah, some people even talk about like the author, the protagonist, and the voice. So I couldn't do without him. But I also felt, it's like such an intimate and from the book fraught relationship that I just didn't feel like there was a stumbling over those parts of the story. And there was something about seeing his name there that changed when I turned it into C. And also I had to, conclude that I wasn't going to be able to render him with the fullness that I was going to render my grandmother, for example, for many reasons, including space, but also, so much is left out of every memoir, as you're so aware, I'm sure. So what are the metrics we're using? How are we filtering? Well, for me, I was eventually arrived at the idea of like, there are several not linear chronological stories, timelines, but there's also this like thematic sectioning. So, and like intellectual or political or, emotional queries that each chapter sets out to explore. So I brought in myself, I brought in C, I brought in other elements as it felt those parameters called for, as opposed to, just trying to fit it all in. That will never happen. And so, yeah, C is almost like a cipher. C is almost like just he's an outline in the book. He comes in as he intersects and moves within the stories of these years that I'm telling. But I wanted to protect that kind of like sacred ground. I needed those boundaries for myself and for him. And I don't think the book needed more C. So yeah, I think of C as a cipher, a true but partial representation of some parts of our relationship and his person. My grandmother is a whole different, set of questions because, yeah, she's not here. She can't technically give her consent. I can't fact check in a certain way. Even though, like I said, I have 3 living uncles and my father, her 4 sons. I have a lot of her other relatives. I have photos. I have recordings, video recordings. So, my first aim was to be as true as I could, to not misrepresent. I'm shy around the word fact. It's not because I don't believe in facts or that I don't think facts matter, but I think that word can be distracting. And so I focus more on true. So that's where some of the fleshing out and the inventing, not necessarily inventing, but the critical fabulation of the scenes, it's very likely that she felt this way. And knowing her and how I saw her interact 100 times with people, I can pretty much see the look on her face in this scene, et cetera, et cetera. And, I used the word ancestral collaboration earlier. I really felt like the presence of a lot of these people with me, and I felt them. I felt the flow when it was working, and when I felt like it was okay to share certain parts of her story. I listened, very intuitively to, the guesses I was making. And I also, if you may have noticed, like I use the word perhaps or maybe strategically all over the place. Perhaps she looked over the horizon. Perhaps she felt this and that. And then there were other times where I was more declarative. And all I can tell you is I really felt like she was nodding along and saying yes. And the last thing I'll say is for all the living folks in the book whose stories I gleaned from them, through interviews and then, asked permission to share. I also held a lot back on my end. There are things my father shared with me that I chose not to put in because it felt like, this is the amount I can trust the world with. There are some things that are so precious I don't want to share, and the book's not asking for them. So let's keep that for us. And I think that comes back to a lot of my thinking around, again, the humanizing and the visibility versus privacy, and pushing back against the conventions of memoir and female or person of color memoirs where people want just ultimate unlimited access. It can be very prurient. There's like this lack of awareness of these people might want boundaries the way that this reader might want boundaries. So that's why the redactions are in there too, just very sparingly, but just to remind the reader, I'm an author crafting this and I'm making choices. And, here's a moment where you're not going to have access. And the same with the Arabic, that was a selective sort of redaction. It's like certain people can come into this more inner circle of the story. There's just going to be a brief interlude, a brief, detour, and we'll meet you on the other side if you're not coming along. So there's like these ins and outs where I just wanted people to be, invited to think about these sort of things. So it's a long answer, but I hope some of it was helpful or made sense.
Absolutely. Invited to think is a beautiful way to invite people to read your book. Thank you so much again. This was very meaningful.
Same, likewise. So grateful. Thank you.
We'll be right back with today's book trend. Well, Grant, maybe the writing was on the wall here, but it's still upsetting that part of the major restructuring and massive layoffs we saw recently at the Washington Post included the killing off of its book section, the beloved book world. I mean, I hate to say this is a trend, but it is, and it feels necessary to say something. So maybe a eulogy, Grant?
Okay, I'm going to give it my best go, Brooke. I wrote up a little eulogy when you asked me about this. So here goes. Bookworld lived a long, bookish life. Born in 1972, it believed, against all evidence, that ideas mattered, sentences could change us, and books deserved more than an algorithmic shrug. It introduced readers to writers before they were famous, argued in good faith, and treated literature as civic infrastructure, not lifestyle content. Bookworld did not die of irrelevance. It died of spreadsheets. May it rest in footnotes, margins, and the stubborn belief that reading is still a public good.
Thank you, Grant. And rest in peace, book world. I mean, this story was covered widely in book media on the day that it happened, which was on February 4th. And as we're recording, it's still very fresh. There are some stories out there on LitHub, our podcasting partner, and Publishers Weekly. Publishers Weekly wrote, standalone book sections in newspapers began disappearing more than 20 years ago, leaving the New York Times Book Review as one of the last survivors. And then there was other interesting coverage out there, too, of what people are saying about the closure. This is also from PW. In a post on X, Bookworld editor Jacob Brogan wrote that he was heartbroken, adding that the existence of a standalone book section felt like a real celebration of culture, of literacy, dialogue, and even debate. Brogan, this is still part of the quote, Brogan also noted that Bookworld's traffic was quite good on the whole, especially relative to the general decline of newspaper audiences across the board. So, capitalism, and obviously Jeff Bezos could choose to use his billions and billions of dollars to figure out how to keep the Washington Post alive, and maybe even revitalize it. It's really hard to find sympathy here for Bezos, and hard to see this anything as other than his mismanagement and his priorities lying in his other businesses that make him a lot more money. And honestly, Grant, how much money does one person need? That question keeps kind of rolling around in my head.
Definitely. Oh my God. And I'm remembering now, just as you're talking, how Kara Swisher wanted to take over the Post from him, and maybe still does. And wouldn't that be lovely? Because, Bezos has repeatedly framed the Post as needing a sustainable business model, not a patron. I think Kara actually has a vision of that, and he is really not the right messenger for that.
No.
I imagine there will continue to be a lot of, personal blowback to him and toward Amazon as a result of this. I hope so. We're already seeing some pretty massive resist Amazon efforts going on social media and in progressive media. And a lot of people also make the argument that book sections lose money but create intellectual capital. And I think that's true. We're going to see a very diminished Washington Post, and boycotts and cancellations do work, but it's not wrong to speculate that the Post has lost a ton of credibility and subscribers when the executive decision was made not to come out in favor of any presidential candidate in 2024. And in fact, it was a public scandal because the editorial board came out for Kamala Harris, and then the Post's leadership, including Bezos, killed it. So this is what you call not independent journalism, since Bezos's motivation was clearly around keeping Amazon safe and thriving.
Yeah, I looked up the numbers, Grant, and after that announcement, when the Post decided not to endorse Kamala, the paper lost 250,000 subscribers, wow, which was about 10% of its digital subscribers in the immediate aftermath. And, what we're seeing here reminds me of that old truism, death by a thousand cuts. Like, the Trump administration and the billionaires that are in his pocket are slowly killing this country. And that is not hyperbole. Like, our institutions, things that matter to people, we're just becoming a country whose sole driver is the almighty dollar. And I think it's been that way, but it's just so much more egregious, and you just see it everywhere, and it's scary and heartbreaking because the cost is so extreme that I don't even think we can begin to measure it.
I'm so sorry to our listeners that our trends are often so negative, but it's also the truth of our situation and the era that we're living through. And I try to stand by the quote that's often attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. Love thinking about this, that the arc of the moral universe is long. And I hope that's true for the sake of our kids and the things we hold valuable and meaningful. And silver lining, I suppose, is that places like Substack and other independent media are thriving. So even as we lose these institutional strongholds that do have a lot of meaning in history, like Book World, we will continue to celebrate books, and there will always be people doing the work to help connect readers to books and authors. And I know Washington Post book editor Ron Charles is definitely on Substack and writing there, so subscribe to his Substack. And of course, we're doing that here.
Yeah, we are, and people will find their way out there for sure. So thank you. And we will find a more optimistic note to end on, because also, like, podcasts and Substacks don't replace Book World. But these people who love books are always going to find their way to their readers. And, there are lots of book podcasts, of course, and people like us doing this kind of work are channels to those efforts. And so I do think this is not a bad place to make a plug to say that if you have been listening for a while, consider supporting us. We are our own little form of independent media after all. And we would love for you to do something for us that is free, which is to rate the show or give us some stars. It really does help. And I know, like, I listen to so many podcasts and I just am like, that's a nice idea, and I don't actually rate the show. But I have actually started to do that in support of independent media. And anybody who wants to pay us like $5 or $10, we have a thing called Buy Me a Coffee, which you can do a literal one-time tip of $5 or $10, and we do appreciate it. We put hours and hours and hours of time into this podcast, and we will happily do it for free, and we do, and we have been for 8 years. But this feels like an appropriate moment to say, you know what? Fuck Jeff Bezos and support the people who are doing good work in the world. So you can find that Buy Me a Coffee thing in the show notes, and we'll put it in there. But, whether it's us or other people who are bringing you the information and content that keep you going, it's hard to ask for money. And so I'm asking it for us, but I'm asking it for other people as well. Support the people who are bringing you the things that you listen to. We thank you, listeners. Truly thank you. And we will see you next week.